Hello, welcome and thanks for choosing this video course. In this video, I'm going to teach you the formula for high converting webinars. One of the most important factors in your webinar success is the work you put into designing your deck of slides. This is important as in any presentation, especially webinars. In an in-person presentation, you're the main visual for your audience and your slides are merely visual aids. But when it comes to a webinar, your slides are not your visual aids anymore. They are your visuals. Thus, you need to put more work into them than you would with an in-person presentation. Of course, your slide deck is just one part of what makes your webinar engaging, but it is a very important factor because your slides play such a prominent role in a webinar. Hence, in this video, we're going to look at the formula to make engaging, high-converting webinars. Let's get started. Like I've mentioned earlier, your slide deck is an important issue to take note of. You need to build your webinar slide deck accordingly and logically. First, let's talk about the introduction. The introduction of your webinar might only take a few minutes, but it sets the scene and your audience's expectations for the rest of the webinar. Start with a title slide with your webinar title, your name and your photograph. Optionally, you can include other information such as names and logos, your contact information, or logistics information about joining the webinar. Some participants will be new to webinars, so you need to explain to them how a webinar works. For example, how to ask questions, whether a recording is available, whether you keep questions anonymous, and so forth. Even if you're presenting to an audience who's familiar with webinars, it's still worth including this slide simply as a reminder. Next is to include a webinar slide early in your webinar so participants know how your content is arranged. For example, if your webinar has 5 main points, your overview slide simply lists those points. Although this can be a very simple slide, it plays an important role because it shows the audience the big picture of your material. They'll discover how many points you want to cover. They see the points and they can mentally track your progress during the webinar. Although you've used many slides in the introduction, it doesn't take much time during the webinar, perhaps 5 minutes at most. Now comes the main content of your webinar, which does take most of the time. However, it is also important to structure the slides in a logical sequence. This is for your main points to flow easily and make sense to your audience. There are many ways to structure your material. First is the timeline. The timeline includes past, present, and future. This classic structure often appears in business presentations. For example, how were things done in the past, what is the current situation, and what are you proposing for the future? This structure is particularly useful when your webinar is about change or if the underlying environment has changed and your audience doesn't realize it. Some topics lend themselves to a geographical approach. For instance, you are describing something that affects people differently in different parts of the country. You provide a brief introduction and then talk them through the impact of each of the locations and summarize in your conclusion. For some topics, it's useful to explain the problem and then describe the solution. I'm sure you don't want to leave your audience with more questions than answers, do you? Next would be audience interaction. Don't wait until the end of your webinar for audience interaction. As part of your preparation, design specific points for your interaction and show slides at those points to prompt your audience. When you plan to stop for a question, insert a Q&A slide in your presentation to this point so it's clear to the audience that you are waiting. This is more effective than simply asking, "Any questions?" while still showing the previous slide. You can, of course, stop for questions at other times depending on your audience needs and the flow of the webinar. However, it's useful to schedule some specific times for questions as part of your preparation. When you stop for an audience poll, insert a slide with the poll question on it. You show this slide first, briefly describe the poll, and then launch the poll in the webinar software. This is better than launching the poll immediately because you get the chance to add any specific instructions before people respond to the poll. It's also useful when you have somebody else managing the polls. This is because they know exactly when they need to launch them for you. For many people, the start and end of the presentation can be the most memorable sections. So plan your concluding slides carefully to reinforce your main message and encourage your participants to take action. In the same way you start the webinar's main content with an overview slide, you can end the main content with a summary slide. This could be as simple as repeating the overview slide, or it could be a separate slide with a summary of your main points. If your webinar ends with a specific action plan, show a slide summarizing that plan so you can talk through it step by step. Some webinars do not end with a specific action plan because their main purpose is to inform or educate. If this is the case, use the slide that asks each participant to reflect on the webinar and decide what action they'll take. Hours of hard work planning a webinar and creating valuable content combined with a significant investment in promotional spending to drive registration will not matter if no one's listening during the webinar delivery. If a webinar is planned without interactivity at the core, it is more likely your audience will be checking Facebook, emails, daydreaming, eating a snack, or drooling on their keyboard. To avoid this fate, you need to master the virtual interaction tricks. The first one is to ask for everyone's first name and recognize them. This is a crafty way to set an interactive tone right from the start and also let your audience know that you are a live person paying attention to them instead of a recorded voice. Ask them to enter their first name in the Q&A and then welcome a few of the attendees by name. You'll be amazed at how much more interaction you'll get throughout the webinar if you try this simple technique right at the start. Secondly is to answer questions and acknowledge comments as you go. Not every speaker can do this, and it takes some practice to do well. Once you're comfortable, keep an eye on the Q&A and answer relevant questions or acknowledge a comment as you go. This does not mean that you should stop the presentation for a designated Q&A moment, which can ruin the flow. You should have a conversation with your audience instead. For instance, if you're talking about widgets and someone comments that widgets are great, verbally agree with him and keep going. Besides, you can ask the audience about their experience, input, and thoughts. Everyone's favorite topic is themselves. If you can get them thinking about how your topic relates to them personally, they'll be more likely to remember the content you're presenting. Ask them what their experience is in the area you're discussing, or ask them to share their insight or learning around the topic at hand. Using a poll or open chat is a good way to collect this feedback and get them interacting with you. If you want to elevate your webinar registration and attendance conversion rates, helping to preserve your promotion campaign investment, you need to do some practices for webinar registration. Without further ado, let me tell you the do's and don'ts during the registration. First, do use the event details page as your landing pad, especially if people are touching down on your registration site from a brief email or a banner ad. This event detail page is your chance to expand on the topic and specific value prospective registrants can plan to take away. Next is do boost your attendance rate by spending the time and brainpower to create a well-thought-out confirmation landing page for registrants who submit registrations. Do include all the event details, including time as well as how to join on the day of the event. As for the don'ts, do not create a massive registration form. Too many fields to fill out can be a turn-off for potential registrants. Do not use form names as admin, webinar registration, or something equally generic and unidentifiable. Do not use the name of the webinar organizer unless that person is very well known to your audiences. Half the battle is getting the registrants to open the confirmation email. Trust me, you want that Outlook calendar invitation on their calendar to block their time and remind them to attend.